I'm excited to offer you a special gift. If you're a U.S. resident, text FERTILE to 345-345. You'll be prompted to enter your email address and you'll receive our fertility yoga download. In this 20-minute intro video, we focus on a calming and peaceful practice to connect back to your heart. These simple fertility yoga poses can help quiet negative thoughts and make you feel more in control. Download it now and get started today. So for U.S. residents, text FERTILE, FERTILE, to 345-345. For non-U.S. residents, go to www.yogafreebie.com to access your special gift. That's www.yogafreebie.com to access the free fertility yoga download.
Also changes the signaling of cortisol from the adrenal glands. When the system is healthy, cortisol gives a gentle backup to help raise blood sugar. But if there's too much coming out, that can blunt cortisol and make it to where it's not there and then gone, but it's always there a little bit.
Welcome to Get Pregnant Naturally, where functional medicine and natural fertility solutions will help you get pregnant and have your baby. Hey everyone, I'm Sarah Clark, and my mission is to inspire, motivate, and empower you. And most of all, I want you to wake up. So with functional medicine, we can discover what causes infertility and eventually reverse the condition. Today, I'm welcoming Dr. Alan Christensen to the podcast, and we're digging into liver health and the link to infertility. Dr. Alan Christensen is a naturopathic endocrinologist who focuses on thyroid function, adrenal health, and metabolism. He has been actively practicing in Scottsdale since 1996 and is the founding physician behind Integrative Health. He is a New York Times best-selling author whose books include The Metabolism Reset Diet, The Adrenal Reset Diet, and The Complete Idiot's Guide to Thyroid Disease. Dr. Christensen regularly appears on national media like Dr. Oz, The Doctors, and The Today Show. Check out his website at drchristensen.com. And before we jump into today's show, don't forget to hit the subscribe button on iTunes or wherever you're listening to this to make sure you never miss an episode. Hey, Dr. C, excited to have you on the podcast.
Hey, Sarah, super glad to be here with you.
Great. So I find that most people that have their own story as to how they came to this work. And I know you definitely have your own story, but you could share with us how you came to this work.
Oh, for sure. I had a lot of struggles early in life that sent me this direction. I had cerebral palsy as a child and seizures related to that. And it's kind of an odd start. I read at an early age and I could figure things out from books pretty well, but I just didn't function that well physically. I couldn't really do sports or run well or whatnot. And I don't know, I was more or less okay with it, knew nothing different, but somewhere around adolescence, the social world became important. How others saw me, and I was much more of an outlier then than I think had I been the same size I would be today. There weren't as many heavy kids, but I was. And, the teasing and taunting, it really drove me to want to figure out how to change my body and how to change how my system worked. And I went through book after book and tried a lot of things that were, well-intentioned, but not well executed. And then eventually got some traction and made some momentum and, became more fit and reversed a lot of chronic symptoms, dropped a bunch of weight, and a brand new world opened up. And it just led me with this incredible conviction that, your health just dictates the quality of your life, and that sometimes the health resources that you would expect to have the answers may not, but sometimes just the right facts that you could stumble across, that you could apply well, could be life-changing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And so today we're going to be digging into the role of the liver and as it affects our fertility. But let's dig into what exactly is the role of the liver in our body.
Well, it's a great question. It pretty much regulates everything. It's been thought of a lot as just a filter. It catches junk that's moving through, and that's totally true. But I think one of the real prime roles that it plays that will come up in our conversation is its role as a buffer, as a storage area. Every second, there's just thousands of chemical reactions occurring in our body. And a lot of these depend upon the right amount of chemicals in our blood and our lymphatic fluid. And all those things have to be controlled. And all these chemicals, ultimately everything comes from our diet, of course, and it's either directly things like vitamins that float around or things that we make out of modified amino acids. So it's all stuff that comes from the diet, but we're not consuming all the things we need in the right amounts and the right times. We only eat a few times per day. So the liver is storing energy and nutrients and neurotransmitters and immune, all kinds of stuff, and then doling that out as need be. So that's like the prime role that becomes relevant for our discussion about energy metabolism.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then as we dig into the importance for hormones and fertility, why would someone need to know about this liver?
Yeah, that's a great question. So along that same line of regulation, I neglected to include the category of hormones. Our glands, I've almost come to think of this as, so animals have speaking of fertility, two different strategies for reproduction. Human strategy is you have just a couple of babies and you take care of them. And then some animals like, frogs have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of babies, and maybe a handful survive, and that's good enough, right? So the latter example is more how our glands work. So the ovaries, the thyroid, the adrenals, they pump out a lot of stuff, figuring your body won't need most of it. And it's true. So your liver holds on to quite a bit of it and then converts or activates hormones as need be. So we've often thought a lot about just the role of when things are off, why are the glands not working right? In many cases, the glands are working fine, but the liver is holding on to too much or converting it in wrong ways or doing other things that are affecting how those hormones play out.
Yeah. So as far as around the digestion, can you kind of dig into that a little bit more and with liver if someone's having digestion issues?
Yeah, strong ties in that way. It's funny, we think about the intestinal tract as the entry point for the body, and kind of is, but in other ways, the liver is more so like the port of entry. What you swallow is not in your body. It's just in a tube that's inside your body. And once you assimilate something, then it enters your body. But what we assimilate goes through almost exclusively the small intestine and through some blood vessels, through some veins that lead straight to the liver. So the first place that things enter your system really is the liver. And there's unique cells called Kupffer cells in the liver that are regulating the whole immune system. And we're now learning that the feedback from the liver to the intestinal tract is one of the largest drivers for whether there's permeability, whether you've got healthy flora present, how well the normal movement is working for the intestinal tract. Most digestive symptoms come down to the category of IBS or irritable bowel syndrome. And the one mechanism known to be central to that is abnormal nerve signaling. And it seems that the liver's role for bile in terms of the properties of it and the amounts of it that enter the small intestine are among the largest drivers of that nerve signaling. So in the past, it was thought much more that the gut affected the liver, which is true, but now we're seeing that vice versa is a huge driver in all nature of digestion and digestive symptoms.
Mm-hmm. I think this leads into the next question so I think people here listening to this podcast hopefully have learned about leaky gut. We've talked a little bit about leaky brain, and then there's also leaky liver, which I haven't heard of. So can you maybe give an explanation of each of those so we can kind of dig in a little more?
Yeah, and they're different in the sense that gut and brain are both things that get in that shouldn't get in, whereas liver is the opposite. So with leaky gut or intestinal permeability, it's just like you got a screen door that's got holes in the screen. So you're in Toronto, and do you guys have mosquitoes there?
Yeah, we do.
Okay, so I'm from northern Minnesota, and we had world-class mosquitoes. If you had some holes in your screen, you would know about that. There'd be some buzzing at night that you couldn't make go away, and the screen was a good thing. But if the gaps were too large, stuff would get in you didn't want to get in. You want the screen so air could flow through, but the same thing works in the intestinal tract. So a lot of nutrients we do want to assimilate, but there's a lot of normal food products that are not all the way broken down, that are harmless when they're on their way out of the body, but they can trigger inflammation if they enter the bloodstream. And so if the gaps in the intestinal lining are too large, it's just like that screen door mosquitoes get in. And in the brain, there's a similar pattern. There's a thing called the blood-brain barrier. And everything in your circulation is outside of the brain, the spinal cord, except for what goes inside this barrier. And that's there because your brain is delicate and the chemistry is even more exacting than it is in your peripheral circulation. But there's been arguments that that barrier itself may be compromised. And in some situation, molecules that are too large or just not appropriate, they get in, just like the mosquitoes sneaking through the gap in the screen door. Now, leaky liver is really the opposite. I think of this more like, I don't know, like you got a sponge you're cleaning up your sink with and you left it there on the counter and now it's leaking all over. So your liver, I talked about its role as storing things. And it stores, among other things, it stores energy. And I call this fuel from the diet. And it's holding on to that. And what happens is that if it ever has way too much, that too much fuel becomes dangerous. And the cells inside the liver, if there was so much fuel in the liver that it couldn't keep it out of its cells, it would kill all of those cells. It'd be like, never shutting off your engine and always keeping it going way above the red line. So your liver has to be able to block the effects of fuel. And one way it does that is by pushing out extra fuel. So this is kind of a funny thing, but diabetes, we know that people wake up and their blood sugar levels are too high. And if you pause for a moment and think that through, that's not because they just ate Twinkies. This is over the course of the night when they were not eating by and large, but they've got high blood sugar. So what happens is that there's a normal signal that hits your liver and says, hey, we've not eaten for a while. Our blood sugar might get low. We could use some glucose. And in a healthy liver, it says, sure, how much do you want? You want 3 units? There's 3 units. We're all good. But when the liver is overloaded, the body says, yeah, I want 3 units. The liver says, you want 3? Well, I've got to dump a bunch. So here's 10. And that's leaky liver. So the normal response of the liver giving the body fuel becomes excessive. And yeah, that's high blood sugar, that's high triglycerides, that can be high cholesterol levels. And there's more data talking about diabetes as a disease of the liver, more so than a disease of the pancreas.
Yeah, and then how does it then that impact the microbiome then with the leaky liver?
Well, what happens there is the excess amount of fuel release changes the type of bile that's secreted. And it makes it to where it's like you're taking an antibiotic. You've got this unhealthy bile with too much bile salts coming through more continually rather than in discrete bursts. And you can harm some of the more protective type of flora in the intestinal tract. So yeah, there's some direct ties in with that. And that's one of the reasons that we see compromised immune function in diabetics as a more extreme example. They're never really getting this proper ebb and flow. The other pitfall about this is that it also changes the signaling of cortisol from the adrenal glands. When the system is healthy, cortisol gives a gentle backup to help raise blood sugar. But if there's too much coming out, that can blunt cortisol and make it to where it's not there and then gone, but it's always there a little bit.
Which then impact the sex hormones. Can you talk a little bit about cortisol and then the impact there as to why that's important for fertility?
For sure. So that's the whole story with PCOS, with polycystic ovarian syndrome. And in the presence of a healthy ebb and flow of cortisol, then we'll see good ovarian function. So when the body's working well, we make a burst of cortisol in the morning. It's called the cortisol awakening response. And then we shut that off as night goes on. But when that response is altered, then almost every other rhythm in the body, that's like the conductor of the whole band. And everything that goes on in the body is on a schedule, is on a cycle. And we think about the monthly menstrual cycle, but there's a lot of daily cycles and a lot of seasonal cycles, and they're all thrown off when that cortisol signaling is altered. So the adrenals also do a lot of overlap with the ovaries. And if the ovaries are putting out inappropriate amounts of hormone, then the adrenals will often make higher amounts of androgenic hormone. And then we'll see things like more of a block of ovulation. We can see facial hair growth or acne or other more of the androgenic symptoms of PCOS. And yeah, the inhibition of fertility. And in many cases, it's something that some are more susceptible than others, but the ultimate core issue behind that can be this problem of the liver and it's how it's regulating fuel and how it's breaking down the hormones.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then a lot of people that we work with and speak to on a regular basis have been on long-term hormonal birth control pill.
Mm-hmm.
And so how does that impact the function of the liver?
Yeah. So the liver has 2 main pathways. There's more subtypes for sure, but they're often broken down as like phase 1 or phase 2. And the first one, you're taking chemicals and you're preparing them to be eliminated. And in the second one, you're packaging them. So this has been called oxidation and conjugation. You're getting them stirred up and loosened up and then bound up so they can be safely eliminated from the body. So contraceptives, they're hormone analogs. They're not the same hormones our body makes, but they're kind of like hormones, and they're much more concentrated. And the net effect they tend to have on the liver function, one thing they do is they really speed up that phase 1 process, so they can make detoxification not occur as smoothly. And the drawback there is that will change how well the body is regulating normal amounts of estradiol or progesterone for some time. The other really pronounced effect they have is on a compound called thyroid binding globulin. Now, along with the liver storing hormones, most hormones that are made are bound up with inactivating proteins in circulation. And when these binding proteins increase, the overall amount of active hormone just plummets. So anyone who's on a contraceptive will end up being more low thyroid than the same person who was not. And that low level of thyroid function can also diminish ovarian signaling and diminish fertility and have many other health implications.
Yeah, we see a lot of people that have got either undiagnosed hypothyroidism or undiagnosed Hashimoto's, and a lot of them have been on long-term birth control. And we did have Dr. Jolene Brighton on podcast back in January, and she talked about post-birth control pill syndrome. So yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and there's a vicious cycle too that ensues with the thyroid in the liver, in that when there's too little activation of thyroid hormone by the liver, or too much thyroid binding globulin that's inhibiting it, then we see that the liver is slowing down in terms of how well it's burning fuel. And so when it does that, there's often a further decrease of its ability to activate thyroid hormone in a vicious cycle. And then also we can see that the inflammation that ensues from that can be the trigger for someone lapsing into, lasting, persistent autoimmune thyroid disease.
Mm-hmm. And so the connection between liver health and thyroid health, which we just kind of talked about briefly there, but anything else you'd like to say there?
That's a big thing. There's also just a lot of overlap between thyroid disease and liver disease, and also diabetes. So the most common liver disease is one called fatty liver syndrome, and the rates of that are highest amongst people who have thyroid disease as well.
Mm-hmm. And what about liver enzymes?
Sure. So in blood work, there's some liver enzymes. The most specific is one called alanine aminotransferase, or ALT. And this is pretty neat. It's part of just like every basic blood panel almost entirely. Whenever blood tests are done, it's almost always tested. And all cells in the body do their job. They live out their lives and they die, and baby cells take their place. So liver enzymes, because especially ALT, because it's unique to liver cells, when we see that floating in the bloodstream, it means that some liver cells died and popped open and spilled that out in the blood. And a little bit is normal, but when the rates are higher, then we know that there's some higher rate of cell death occurring in the liver. And that's often one of the first signs for that. A great point for female listeners is that what's considered normal for ALT, there's really strong agreement amongst liver specialists that the range is far too high, especially for women. Most labs say that you're normal if your ALT is as high as 48 or 63. And some reference ranges will be adjusted based upon the gender of the patient, but this one is not. And the evidence is very strong that if you're a woman and your ALT is above 19, there's something wrong with your liver. It's not specific, but there's some kind of a problem present.
Mm-hmm. And so you have a book, one of your books is about adrenal health. I don't have the exact name of that book. I'm sorry. What was the name of your adrenal?
That's the Adrenal Reset Diet.
Yeah, the it's there. Yeah, the Adrenal Reset Diet. And so we can just talk about that with fertility and the liver.
Sure. So cortisol is one of 57 hormones made by the adrenal glands, and the bulk of it is made in a form called cortisone. And that's not an active hormone. That's the precursor, and that's just circulating, waiting to get turned on, so to speak. And then your liver has an enzyme called 11-beta-hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase, and it activates cortisone and makes it into the more potent cortisol. But when the liver is not working well, there may be too much conversion that takes place, too much activation. You're basically making stress hormones. All the bad things that happen to your body if you're under a severe example like PTSD, and all the ways that wears down the immune system and raises cardiovascular risk. That same stuff happens when the liver breaks down the adrenal hormones inappropriately. And that's often one of the big drivers I mentioned a moment ago behind PCOS, that whole chain of events that alters that cortisol slope.
And what about any infections with you're dealing with in the body and the liver? How does that?
Yeah, so it's a funny thing, but there's all these various drivers of inflammation that are now spoken about, and the question always becomes, what's the most core issue? And there's a lot of infections that are really talked about a lot in the whole pop health circles about chronic Lyme, Epstein-Barr, and they're often relevant factors. But the logical question is, why is everyone not affected in the same way? Like Epstein-Barr, for example, 98% of adults have been exposed, and most, it's just irrelevant, it's a thing in the background. But for a subset of people, their immune systems are not capable of keeping it suppressed, or they're not specifically targeting that virus. And so the question becomes, yeah, the virus is bad, we'd like it to go down, but what was different about them? And why was it their body was unable to do so? And the emerging model behind a lot of chronic infections is that there's a group of cytokines called adipokines. And I'll need to back up for just 1 second. So we store fat in the body in 3 different ways. There's the subcutaneous fat, which is just the stuff under our skin. And that's, hips and thighs or whatnot. And we may not wish that we had it, but it's pretty harmless stuff. It doesn't correlate a lot with disease risks. And it may even have positive correlations with overall fertility. Then we have what's around the organs that's been talked about a lot as the visceral fat or the belly fat. And kind of a funny thing, the emerging data is that this is a protective mechanism. And by itself, it's really not harmful. And the more someone is capable of making visceral fat, the less apt they are to have liver disease or diabetes. But however, when visceral fat, when that compartment gets filled up, then the overflow is into something called organ fat. And that's different in that it's fat that's now not surrounding the organs, but within the organs, especially the liver. And that can be within the cells, or the worst thing is when it's around the cells of the liver and the pancreas. And that type of fat, that organ fat, releases compounds called adipokines. And it seems that these inflammatory chemicals are among the largest drivers of causing people, apart from obvious factors of immunosuppression like strong medications or chemotherapy or chronic HIV, apart from more direct causes like that, when everyday people are falling prey to Epstein-Barr or Lyme, we think that these adipokines, these chronic inflammatory signals coming from organ fat in the liver, they're the biggest drivers behind all of that.
And what if there's a parasite or a bacterial infection or any of those other kind of infections? How does that impact the liver?
Sure. So the liver itself can be infected. There are some third world examples of parasites that burrow inside of it, not so much relevant to the modern world, but we do also have viral infections of the liver, and those all come under the subhead of the viral infectious hepatitis. So we've got hepatitis A, B, and C. Bacterial infections, there are cases of septicemia, to where someone has a infection that's moved from like the soft tissues, like say if someone has cellulitis in their hip and that migrates into the blood throughout the body, then that circulating infection and the toxins from it become also built up in the liver itself, since it is filtering the blood and managing it. So those are not so much common things that, as a broad distinction in medicine, we talk about horizontal concerns and vertical concerns. So horizontal, like laying down, and vertical, like standing up. So there's certain things that happen to hospitalized patients, like in intensive care units, when they're not up and about walking and wondering why they're not feeling well. They're minimally functional. So a lot of those types of things in terms of septicemia, infections involving the liver directly, they're more relevant for horizontal concerns than they are for vertical concerns, or people might be like walking around or listening to a podcast or trying to sort out their health. That's typically more of a different audience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we typically do the GI map for people that are dealing with fertility, and time it up finding different gut infections and then going through.
For sure, and gut infections can affect liver function. I guess the distinction I was making is that they're not so much like in the liver itself, but their chemistry can then impact how the liver is working, for sure.
Mm-hmm. And so what's your take on gluten? I noticed that you just recently had a post on a different, because here we recommend people going dairy and gluten-free for at least 3 months. And then if that doesn't produce any results or improved health, and then to dig further with functional testing. And I think you've had a different change in thought around gluten recently.
If someone's cut it out and it's been helpful for them, there's certainly no drawback to that. It's great if they just discovered something. But the question that I was addressing was, is it a helpful recommendation for populations to just cut out gluten across the board as a long-term practice? And that question was looked at with the Nurses Health Initiative study and also with the NHANES study. And it turns out that large populations back up a bit, even populations that have medical benefits by going gluten-free, like those with celiac disease, for example, it's been known for quite some time that these populations, when they go gluten-free, they have chronic rates of obesity. They often gain a lot of weight. And one thought was, perhaps they were malabsorbing food, now they're absorbing food better. There appears to be that, but it seems there's more to the story than just that part of it. So I've always been curious as to whether or not something that's just a good idea across the board for people, or if that's helpful for someone that's had a specific response. And the data is pretty strong that people that just electively go gluten-free, if there's not some clear reason they're doing it, they're not healthier than those that do not. We see higher rates of obesity, higher rates of diabetes, and based on a pretty large study, higher rates of cardiovascular death. And I'd heard some earlier studies that hinted at these risks, thought that perhaps many who have gone gluten-free just ate a lot of gluten-free junk food. I think that was a pretty valid concern. Maybe someone's overall diet quality went low. They're eating a lot of processed gluten-free foods. There's now more of those available. But some of the larger or other thoughts were that perhaps they were lowering their fiber intake. They're eating a lot of other processed gluten-free foods that were just devoid of fiber. And so the biggest study that I was referring to, they even looked at the diet at that level, and they looked to see if there was an increase in processed or ultra-processed foods, if there was a decrease in fiber, and they showed that that was not the predictor of cardiovascular death. The predictor was the avoidance of whole grains. So when someone's whole grain intake went down because they chose to go gluten-free, there was a higher rate of cardiovascular death because of that. So when someone does find that going gluten-free is helpful for them in some way, that's awesome to discover that, but it's worth also thinking about just the general benefit of whole grains in the diet. And there's non-gluten options available for people in those situations.
Yeah, and so to dig in, so obviously if you have celiac or non-celiac gluten sensitivity and you have a high sensitivity to gluten, then that's not advised. But if you're just doing it to join the keto or the paleo or all these different diet trends, maybe to rethink it. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's if gluten were just inherently toxic to humans across the board, we would think that people that go gluten-free for whatever reason are healthier, that they have less obesity and less diabetes and lower rates of heart disease, but the exact opposite seems to show up. So it's something that I think should just be a deliberate choice and thinking about other ways to compensate for that possible lack of whole grains.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. And so how do we support the liver with some food, some supplements? What are some strategies that we have here?
Yeah. So the thing about liver support is pretty popular and talked about a lot nowadays. And the idea is that the liver needs more of something. It needs some more help. And it often does. My main focus is, what's the core problem? What's really off with the liver? And for many people, they're struggling with their fertility, or their blood sugar is not regulated, or their body weight doesn't respond the way it should, or their energy is not stable. And when the liver is involved, the core issue is really just this glut of energy, just too much stored energy. To be really precise, the liver stores two kinds of that. There's glycogen, which is made from carbohydrate, and then there's triglycerides, which are made from anything, carbohydrates, fats, ketones, even alcohol. They can all be made into triglyceride. And specifically, it's the ratio between the two of those that predicts the function of the liver. You need a little glycogen to burn triglyceride. So it's kind of like you need kindling to ignite a log. Glycogen carries much less energy than triglyceride, but it's much easier to activate it. Whereas triglyceride, once you get it burning, you can get a lot of energy from that, but you've got to ignite it and get it burning. And what happens is that since it's easier to make triglyceride, that the body can store more of that. And the space inside the liver cells, more gets devoted to triglycerides. And they've shown pictographs of this. It just squeezes down the space where the glycogen would go. There's just no more room. And that's what happens in fatty liver syndrome. But it's also happening to people that wouldn't be diagnosed as having fatty liver, but they're having struggles in those areas. So the trick is, how do you get out that toxic amount of triglyceride without taking away the glycogen? Because that's a pitfall about just eating less, or just going extreme low carb or whatever else, or just fasting, is that it's easy to lower both types of fuel at once, but it's really tricky to lower one type while you're raising the other.
Mm-hmm. And so what are some strategies then to help with that?
Well, we've gone through a lot of iterations in our clinic. There's a protocol that we were first using for treating type 2 diabetes, and seeing how it was consistently reversing the liver disease in those with diabetes, we kept evolving that and adjusting on it. And the general idea is that we want to stabilize blood sugar. And the old thought was that whenever you want to stabilize blood sugar, you just consume less carbohydrate. And the pitfall is that we now know that most of your blood sugar does not come from dietary carbohydrate. There's some pretty cool new studies in which they can do radioisotopes on glucose, and they can watch someone after they eat. And after a meal, someone that has compromised their metabolism, 85% or more of the glucose that hits their bloodstream doesn't come from the meal. It's really more about leaky liver than it is from carbs spiking the blood sugar and all that stuff. So the trick is, how do you keep the blood sugar stable and steady? And one part of that, I relied pretty heavily upon resistant starch. It's a non-fiber, non-carbohydrate compound that gives about 7 to 9 hours of stable blood sugar. So I use that quite a bit in this protocol. And then the other trick is, how do we break down those triglycerides? So I included a healthy enough amount of protein, mostly plant-derived protein, but mixtures of that. And then also a low enough amount of fuel from fats, carbs, ketones, all sources, a low enough amount to where the body can tap into the stores. But we're keeping blood sugar steady, we're supplying protein, so the net effect is that we can help the liver detox and get rid of some of those toxic stores of triglycerides, but support and improve the glycogen load along the way.
And can you give us an example of what a meal would look like with that then?
You know, funny thing, I just heard the stat recently. So the average person makes about 200 food decisions per day. And I also wanted to make this to where it was just easy for people and was effective. So to hit all those targets of resistant starch and protein and low fuel, I set up the basic format of 2 shakes, 1 meal, and then also unlimited snacks. So the meal, the evening meal, is nothing really unusual. You got some kind of a healthy lean protein. If someone's vegan, they've got some options that way for plant proteins, non-vegans, that can be fish or poultry, whatever else. Then a nice source of healthy, slow-burning carbs, especially those that are high in resistant starch. That can be things like potatoes or legumes as good options. And then tons of veggies. So pretty simple stuff that way. The shakes are really centered around vegetable protein and then also dense sources of resistant starch. Then I also included a lot of phytonutrients from plants, from just plant foods that help regulate the proportions of those phase 1, phase 2 liver pathways. And then the unlimited snacks are really lots of good veggies, which can be raw or cooked up in various ways. So 2 shakes, 1 meal, and then optional snacks throughout the day as needed.
And then how long does that go on? That goes for 4 weeks? Did I get that right?
Yep, exactly. It's a 28-day process. And we've seen this clinically from retesting those with liver disease and diabetes. And there's also some data about liver damage, like liver damage from Tylenol overdose. They've shown that in the right circumstances, that can reverse itself in about 28 days. So that's the time frame. And the cool thing about it, I guess we've had a lot of challenges going on, or people join us online and we walk them through this whole process. And the part that excites me the most is when I hear people say that, I did that months ago. And now the diet that I was on before, maybe they were paleo or AIP or vegan, whatever it was, the diet they were on before is now working better for them. And their weight's still stable, or it's coming down a bit. They're feeling better. But the idea is to really make a change in the body. It's not just drop some pounds and now hope things work, but no, you shift the body in a way to where the liver's functioning better again, and it's able to regulate. It's able to make things really balanced where it couldn't before.
And so these 2 shakes that you have, then is that something that you developed, or what are the ingredients or?
Yeah, so we've done clinical trials on a product that we formulated, but also in the book and in the online program, I talk about ways you can do that from just everyday foods, both ways for options. Some folks love the convenience of having something that's mixed up and tested, and they know it's going to work in a certain way. And others have particular dietary preferences, or perhaps they're out of the country or whatnot. So yeah, people have options both ways there.
And then what about supplements to help the liver? What ones that
Honestly, I didn't use a lot in the clinical trial. I do encourage some basic supplementation. And one of the big wrinkles with that is that relative to helping the thyroid function better, it's easy for people to overdo it on the iodine. And this is especially a concern for those who are on thyroid treatment because there's a lot of iodine in all thyroid medication. And iodine's not a bad thing, but there's this sweet spot of about 100 to 300 micrograms per day. And it's pretty tough to get less than 100 in your diet. And then if someone's thyroid medication is another 150 or 200, they may be at that upper safe limit. And the further they go above that, paradoxically, the more it slows down their thyroid. So yeah, I do encourage some basic micronutrients. The tough thing is that a lot of common multivitamins will have iodine or they'll have synthetic folic acid, both of which can be counterproductive. So yeah, I just give details on common amounts of B vitamins, some antioxidants, vitamin C, some essential fats, calcium, magnesium. Nothing too unusual, but I do really want people to avoid the excess amounts of iodine or folic acid.
And then what about environmental toxins and the impact? Did you talk about those at all?
For sure. Yeah, there's a whole relevant condition of toxic steatohepatitis that's known to be a driver. So the things were around like the plastic compounds or lead derivatives, they change the liver in a lot of ways. They can amplify the stress hormones. They can make the liver less sensitive to glucose and insulin signaling. So there's a lot of steps that I encourage that are general things for lowering one's toxic burden, the whole pre-tox. But what we also see is that this fuel overload and all this congested triglyceride in the liver cells, that can be one of the largest inhibitors of the liver's ability to process the waste that we're exposed to. So as this process unfolds, people also find that they're less chemically sensitive than they were before. They have less of a chronic burden for those who measure and track those things. So yeah, when the liver works better in some ways, it has the capacity to work better in other ways as well.
And how do we help with the detoxification process to support the liver, to dig into some of those strategies there? Is there anything else?
That's really it. These are the things that do that. So when the liver has its main effort that it's putting out is processing fuel, it has to work harder on that than anything else. So when you're freeing up that capacity and letting it use some of its old stuck fuel, everything else works better. I was doing a book signing last week at a medical school, and there was hundreds of students there. And the question I always get is, what supplements would someone take along this year? What liver support or what other things to help the liver detox or cleanse? And honestly, it gets to be counterproductive. So the liver has to process all the pills that you take. And I've seen so many cases where people are taking pills that there's no one of those pills that you look at the chemistry and say, oh, well, that's hard on the liver. But if you put together, 12 of them, now they're all things that hit the liver before they go anywhere else. And your liver's got to work on those. So I love to keep it simple and have fewer moving parts and let the body take care of itself. I've done these various retreats with small groups of people. We got one coming up in April, actually. They're a lot of fun, but I've surveyed those that come in. And people who are really avid health consumers, this might blow you away, but the average number of supplements they take when they first come in, the average number is 26. And I would argue that's just not a good idea. And every one of those 26 things might seem like it's completely innocuous, but together they're not. They work differently on the body. So yeah, I love to have people take fewer pills. I see them do much better for it.
Yeah, we use functional testing and then do a targeted protocol. So you're not taking bags and bags of supplements forever. It's a short period of time, and then you go back to those ones that you've mentioned there. So obviously in this case prenatal and magnesium and omegas, so sort of some basics, but not bags and bags, which is stressful in itself.
For sure.
And what about movement? How that helps the liver?
Yeah, so something I want to just pull apart that I didn't really make a good distinction on is there's certain things we see that are important during this whole 20-day reset process, and there's other things that are just great strategies for maintenance. And your skeletal muscles are your liver's best friend. They do a lot of heavy lifting to regulate fuel in your body. They can store glucose, they can store triglycerides, they can help to manage that and buffer it. So yeah, when someone's healthy and it's not a stressor in your body, the more the merrier, and the more types the better. Aerobic training and strength training and balance, agility type work, range of motion, it's awesome. And the data is strong that most are probably doing amounts that are less than optimal for overall health. A lot of the pop health messages have been oh, you'll kill yourself with chronic cardio, or all these bad things happen when you overtrain. And of course it's possible, but the average person is far from risking that. Most folks are the opposite end of that risk range. During the 28 days, however, because I'm lowering the fuel intake, I do reduce exercise to certain thresholds. So people have often tried to, drop a lot of food in their diet and then train really hard for efforts of improving their health. And the pitfall is when you do both of them together, it's a big stressor on your system, and your body has to alter cortisol metabolism to compensate for that. And the net effect is you're often raising the whole oxidative stress, inflammatory load, but you also end up compromising lean body mass. So during the 28 days, I outlined what I call the micro workouts. And those are some things that are calisthenics, they're brief interval workouts. It's about 5 minutes a day, so it's really brief. And then I talk about certain amounts of nice walking or some stretching, but not much beyond that during the 28 days. And then afterward, people can respond better, and their muscles have stayed engaged and stayed active throughout that. And because we're getting healthy amounts of protein as well, there's not a loss for lean body mass. So the exciting change is that someone can have a good waist reduction and, some weight reduction, but more dramatic in terms of the waist. And you see that in fertility about the whole waist to hip ratio being such a big predictor. And people often have an easier time dropping pounds than they do dropping inches. And yeah, this is more targeted to dropping those waist inches.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, we recommend rebounding as well. Do you recommend that for helping with the lymph system?
Sure. Great option.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And what about any kind of teas? Do you recommend that? We often recommend a dandelion or a milk thistle to help then with the liver. What's your thought on that?
Harmless things in general. So dandelion can thin bile secretions. Milk thistle is a bit of it kind of delays the things from leaving the liver cells. And there's a lot of data about milk thistle being good in some types of acute overdose. They're just not things I recommend on an ongoing basis. Dandelion's a nice beverage here and there. There's some drawbacks about chronic use of milk thistle, making the liver have a harder time regenerating cells. So the 28-day process, I really want it to be just as simple as possible. And yeah, I really focused it on foods for those purposes.
And what about the emotional side of things? Sometimes they say if there's something up with the in Chinese medicine, that anger can be kind of related to the liver. What's your take on that?
Sure. So lots of data about how the liver is forming and modulating neurotransmitters before they even reach the brain. And then also the same thing about how it's affecting stress hormones and androgenic hormones. So when it's off, it can be a big driver of that. And then vice versa, when someone's got a chronic cycle of emotional stress, that's making everything more difficult in their body for repair.
Mm-hmm. And so do you find people as they go through this 28 days that how does their mood in the beginning and as we kind of come towards the end of the 28 days? Because we put people on an elimination diet to start off to see if there's any food sensitivities, and they can have in that first week a lot of, if there's issues with mood, the mood could get even worse. They could feel more depressed, crying, then as they move on, they start feeling better. Do you notice any of that as you have people on your program, or I don't know? Yeah,
many do talk about just having a lot of, especially intermittent anxiety symptoms. It's one of the more specific ones. So the other tie-in there is that when your blood sugar is not well regulated, it'll drop off at some points. And when it's dropping, there's this quick burst of cortisol release to elevate the blood sugar. And many will have times to where they'll wake up in the middle of the night and they feel panicky, or they just feel anxious for no clear reason. And in the past, I would often track those people with a device called a continuous glucometer. And we would look at their blood sugar. It measures it continually for about 5 days. And I would have them just make note on when they had symptoms like that emerge. And we would look back on their blood sugar tracing during that same time. And it seemed that there was often either their blood sugar reached a low level, or more commonly, it didn't even get low, but it rapidly declined. It had a quick rate of change. But once they had steady glucose curves and less blood sugar fluctuation, oftentimes those symptoms would just vanish. So yeah, there's a strong tie in there.
And so helping with those snacks and keeping the steady amount of fuel, I guess, in the body and not overfueling.
Yeah. And in the program, the snacks are not as much important for that. That's more so just like the habit of eating and munching. Resistant starch is something that gives about 7 to 9 hours of just steady blood sugar. So the cool thing is if someone gets a good serving of that early in the day and little bits throughout the day, they just don't have big blood sugar swings. And it's often unusual to have someone go for a while and not feel hungry, even when they're not consuming high amounts of food. But that's the real perk behind it.
Yeah, getting that hangry feeling. You're like desperate.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so as far as any kind of a book or a website or an app, anything that you are obsessed with right now, anything that you're loving?
Well, the book has been the focus for a lot of years, for sure. At this very moment, my obsession is parathyroid disease. I'm writing a long blog post about that to make people more aware of it. My doctors and I were just talking about a lot of case reviews these last few weeks, and I've written about it a bit in the past, but it's a lot more common than people think, and it's behind a lot of common symptoms like anxiety or digestive cramping or fatigue or muscle pain. So that's my obsession of the exact moment.
And can you share a little bit about that? So parathyroid disease.
For sure, yeah. So para means next to. So your thyroid gland is, quite much more commonly understood and known about. But typically, on the lower portions of the thyroid, on the sides, there's usually two on each side. These little glands that control calcium in the blood, and it's a really big deal how much calcium is in your blood. It's not like drink more milk or take some supplements or whatnot. Nothing works right on a fundamental biochemical level. Your body can't give the right nerve impulses. Muscles can't contract or relax as they should. Your brain can't function properly. You're pulling calcium out of your bones. The muscles aren't functioning right. Everything's goofed up. And there's some versions of this disease that are really obvious on blood tests because someone's got high levels of calcium. But in many cases, calcium levels are not elevated. And unless a doctor really thinks to suspect it and to look for it specifically, they'll never see it. And the data is strong that it's probably about 1% of the population. It's probably about as common as celiac disease. And some studies have shown that it's even 6 times more common in those who have thyroid disease. So in our clinic, we screen for that routinely. And it's very common. We'll see someone that's tried forever to get their thyroid dialed in, or they've had their thyroid where it looked like it should have been, but they were still suffering with these symptoms. And it turned out they also had parathyroid disease. So what happens is 80% of the time, one of the 4 glands, when it's off, is overactive. And it's just putting out too much hormone that pulls too much calcium out of the bones and the bloodstream. About 15% of the time, it's multiple glands. But when it is identified, 95% of the cases, it's just cured by taking out that rogue gland. And then the others pick up the slack and things are fine. So we've had so many people that have had just years or decades of symptoms that they've struggled with. And they've tried so many things that made sense for their anxiety or their digestion. They're all these diets, restricting all these foods. And then, no joke, a week after parathyroid surgery, it's all gone.
So the recommendation then is to look on a thyroid panel. Is what would we look for there? And then I guess you said
it's not on a thyroid panel. Yeah, so parathyroid means next to the thyroid, but it's not even related to thyroid function. So you wouldn't see it on thyroid tests. There's not any thyroid tests that show for that. So it's obvious when calcium is elevated, but for some people, calcium may be normal or high normal. So if we see suspicious symptoms, it does take a doctor that knows how to test parathyroid function specifically. And there's blood markers for that. There's urinary markers of ionized calcium that takes some combination evaluation, but it takes a targeted evaluation for it.
Got it. Okay, awesome. So, and then as far as a success story, anything you'd like to share with us? I'm not sure if you got anything around pregnancy, fertility.
Around fertility, for sure. There was actually someone that wrote in a few weeks ago that was talking about just her struggles with that and how she had her main approach had been dietary and also supplementation. She had then also seen a few functional medicine doctors and been on progesterone therapy and AIP diet for quite a while. And her struggle had also related to just weight and PCOS. She had known they'd been a big factor for her. And whatever she would do, whenever she would go low carb or go restrictive, she would get better for a bit, but then lose ground and oftentimes end up a little worse off than before. But she came to see us for thyroid function, and we did suggest doing the reset diet initially, like we often do. And it turned out that she was pre-diabetic, and that was tied in with her PCOS. But within 6 weeks after her first 28 days, she was just normal blood sugar. Her A1C, I'm looking at her numbers, they went from 6.3. She was right on the edge of diabetes. They went down to 5.2. So really healthy and optimal. And she was asking about, she was looking at IVF at the time, and we encouraged her just to let the dust settle for a few months. And yeah, she wrote in with the photo of, of the little baby boy. So we haven't seen her for a little bit, but no, that's a common story. And that's not all infertility by any means, but for many, there's a tie-in between how their livers are working and how the body is regulating blood sugar.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you for that. That's nice. So you have a challenge here. So it's the
Metabolism Reset Challenge.
There you go. Thank you. And they can get that at metabolismresetdiet.com/challenge.php. But can you explain what they'll get on that challenge?
For sure. So it's a lot of fun. It's the whole 28-day challenge in the book that we just walk people through, and we give them, recipes, and I show some cooking videos and give them the exercise ideas and make a community around that. And there's 2 phases to that. The whole challenge itself is 28 days, but there's a free version of that, which is that first week. And a lot of people just benefit greatly from that first week, and they call it good. But the main idea is that in the first week, you get a better sense on what this is about, if it makes sense for you, if you found that it's easy to stick with, and if it's been a beneficial thing, then you're welcome to join the remaining 21 days of it. But yeah, we want to put the first week out as just a free service for people to learn more about it and give it a shot if they want to see if they can improve their health in those ways.
Awesome. Great. So we'll have that link in the show notes. So yeah, and thank you so much for coming on the podcast, Dr. C, sharing your words of wisdom all about liver today. And thank you so much.
Well, I really appreciate you having me, and thanks for sharing this with your community. And yeah, appreciate it.
Awesome. Hey there, Sarah Clark here. So are you struggling to have your baby? First of all, please know that my heart goes out to you. I support couples worldwide who are struggling with infertility to conceive and have healthy babies. Women like Rita, who gave birth to her beautiful daughter after following my fertility coaching system. Or Danielle, who after 2 failed IUIs was able to get pregnant after a Supercharger fertility discovery call with me. So here's how you get my help for free. So I offer a free Supercharger fertility discovery call, and on that call, I'll create a plan with you that is going to help you fast track your success. So this call is not for everyone, and I'm really picky about who I get to speak with. And I have a strict but totally reasonable criteria that needs to be met in order for us to move forward. So here's who I can help. So first of all, you need to be able to explore your infertility diagnosis in a new light. So this offers for people who are open-minded, they're coachable, and if you can do that and want to double or triple your chances at the fertility clinic or get pregnant, awesome. So let's get on the phone and chat. Also, you must be an action taker. So someone who's committed to seeing results, you're able to follow directions. Don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to do anything bizarre. But if you're one of those people who like to consume a ton of information, but don't like to spend time implementing and seeing results, then the call's not really for you. So I only want to spend time with people who are genuinely committed to their own success. So just click on the link in the show notes and apply, or go to fabfertile.com and click on the free consult. So it's a really short application that just tells me about your health, how long you've been trying to conceive, and how soon you'd like to be pregnant. So seriously, this is going to be the best time you've ever spent on your fertility. Looking forward to chatting. Talk soon. Thank you for listening to Get Pregnant Naturally. Seriously, it means the world to me that you're here. Make sure you hit the subscribe button so you can be notified of upcoming episodes. I'm excited to offer you a special gift. If you're a U.S. resident, text FERTILE to 345-345. You'll be prompted to enter your email address and you'll receive our fertility yoga download. In this 20-minute intro video, we focus on a calming and peaceful practice to connect back to your heart. These simple fertility yoga poses can help quiet negative thoughts and make you feel more in control. Download it now and get started today. So for U.S. residents, text FERTILE, FERTILE, to 345-345. For non-U.S. residents, go to www.yogafreebie.com to access your special gift. That's www.yogafreebie.com to access the free fertility yoga download. And I love this quote by Dr. Mark Hyman, medical director of the Cleveland Clinic Center for Functional Medicine and chairman of the Institute for Functional Medicine. Functional medicine is medicine by cause, not by symptom. functional medicine practitioners don't in fact treat disease. We treat your body's ecosystem. We get rid of the bad stuff, put in the good stuff, and because your body is an intelligent system, it does the rest. Thanks for listening. Until next time.